A running stitch moves in and out of the fabric going forward, and it will give you the look of a dashed line. You want to try and have your stitches be as even as possible, with the space in between each of the stitches as long as each stitch as well. That way you get a nice consistent line. You also can use this to outline objects, but again, you are still going to get that dashed line. And one thing you want to keep in mind is using small stitches so it won't look choppy. A back stitch is similar to a running stitch, but instead of a dashed line, you'll have a solid line. What you want to do is push your needle out as long as you want your stitch to be, and instead of going forward, you're actually going to put your needle back into where the hole is from the previous stitch. Try and get that right into that same hole so that there's no gap, but it's okay if it's not exactly perfect. Again, when you're outlining an object, if it is rounded, it's good to have smaller stitches so that it doesn't look choppy. Straight areas can have longer stitches, but try to keep it consistent per object. A satin stitch is when you want to fill an area with color. There's a few different things to know about this stitch, so I have a couple different ways I'm going to show you. So for the square here, all I'm doing is always starting at the top and moving down to the bottom, and you want to try and get your stitch as close to the previous one as you can. Here I have a hole, so I go ahead and I just go backwards and fill that in a little bit, and then continue with my stitching. For the triangle here, I wanted to show how to conserve thread a little bit, because if you always go from the top to the bottom, or always in one direction, that'll use up 2 times the amount of thread. With the triangle, I'm trying to go up and down kind of in a zigzag and have my thread come out just to the right of each of my stitches, so that way I'm filling and using less thread up. Also, in the end here, to make the edges nice and clean, decided to outline it with a back stitch. Not necessary, but sometimes can help your object look a little more clean. Here you can see how going back and forth helps to save thread. Finally, I just wanted to show that satin stitch can be used in multiple directions, and also with this heart, you can do the split part and then bring it together at the bottom. Cross stitch is simply making an X with your thread. You can start from any corner of the X and go in whichever direction. It is a good idea to be consistent with how you do your cross stitch, because you will be able to see a slight difference, especially if there's a grouping of a lot of them. You also can make a plus sign instead of the X, it doesn't matter. The Ermine stitch is a small 6-pointed star that is basically a cross stitch with 1 extra line in it. That line can be vertical or horizontal, and it's a good fill stitch. The Arrowhead stitch makes a line of chevrons by having 2 straight stitches that meet at a point in the center. A chain stitch ends up looking like a chain. You start with a foundation stitch, just a small one, and then you're going to come out of the fabric as long as you want your chain stitch to be. Go underneath that foundation stitch to catch your thread, and then back into the same hole that you came out of. You'll repeat this as long as you need, going out underneath both sides of the previous stitch and then back into the same hole. This could be a curved line, zigzag line, whatever it is that you need. And if you pull too hard, you can always fluff those stitches back up at the end. Lazy daisy is similar to a chain stitch, but worked in a slightly different way. You go in and out of the same place of your fabric, but don't pull all the way through. Then come up as long as you want your petal to be, and this is where you're going to make that tiny stitch that holds the thread in place. If you want to actually make a flower, I suggest drawing a circle and working your 4 cardinal directions first, and then working in the empty spaces so that everything looks even. The fly stitch is a capture stitch similar to the lazy daisy. It's wider though, because you're not going back into that same hole, and then you have your straight stitch going down to capture your thread and hold it in place. You can give variety as well with how wide or skinny the fly stitch is, or how long or short that stem is. The scallop stitch is almost exactly like the fly stitch, except the only difference is that your straight stitch down is so small that you should really hardly even be able to notice it. You're trying to make a small U shape, and this is great for scales or even a small smile on a face. For the French knot, pull out through the front, and you're going to wrap the thread around the needle 2 or 3 times, wrapping towards yourself. Hold it in place with your finger and put your needle not in the exact same hole, but very close to where you came out. You want to, with your other hand, hold the thread tight until the very last second when you pull through, so that way that wrapping doesn't come undone. This takes a little bit of practice, and also the more times you wrap around your needle, the bigger your knot will be.